Hi, welcome back. In this video, you'll understand about how to do batch processing. What do I mean by batch processing? Let me tell you the simple example. Let's assume that I have a file with millions of records. Now, what I want to do is I want a flow to poll for any new file in a directory. Whenever there is such a file, I want to take the file, and for each record in this file, I want to do some processing, and let's say I want to update to a database, or maybe I want to upload to Salesforce. So since we have to process millions of records, we want to do it asynchronously in an efficient way. So batch job helps us to achieve this. So first of all, even before going to batch job, let me tell you my use case, what I want to achieve. So I want to create a flow which will poll for new files. So maybe I'll have a flow with on new or update file. You know that. So this will poll for files and get the file. Then I want to add a transformer which will read that file and create a list. So the output payload after this transformer will be a list. Then I want to process each element of the list. For each element of the list, I want to do processing in various steps. So maybe for each step, let's assume that there is a flow. So let's assume that there is one more flow where I want the record to go through. Let's say this is flow 1. And after flow 1 is completed, I want the record to go through flow 2 and finally flow 3. That means for each record in this list, I want each record to go through flow 1, flow 2, flow 3, and I want the flow 2 to be executed only after flow 1, flow 3 to be executed only after flow 2. That means per record, I want these flows to be executed one after the other. So what I could do is, one way I can actually use a for each scope, and inside for each scope I can use a flow reference to refer to flow 1. If that is successful, call flow 2. If that is successful, call flow 3. So that I can do. But if I use for each scope, this is synchronous processing. That means in this list, if there are million records, record 2 will be processed only after record 1 goes through F1, F2 and F3 flows. But what I want is, I want the records in this list to be processed concurrently. Let 100 records be processed concurrently. And each record will go through F1, F2 and F3 flows one by one. So using for each is not a solution because it is synchronous. And one more problem here using for each is, let's assume that while processing 100th record, there is an exception in one of these flows. What will happen is the exception will get propagated and rest of the records will not be processed. So maybe we need to handle exceptions in each individual flow here itself. But what I want is, if exception is thrown while processing one of the flow, I will consider that the record failed. Processing of that record failed in one of the flow. So maybe if up to 100 record failures, I don't want to stop the processing of the other records. If more than 100 records are failing means what? Exception is thrown in any one of these flows. So if more than 100 records are failing, what I may want to do is I want to stop further processing of the records in this list. So what I could do is, in this case, I can have a error handler in each of these flows where I'll increment a counter. So if the count value is greater than 100, I can write a condition in this for each loop not to process the records further. But again, too much of manual things. And again, here, whenever we are using for each, the records are processed step by step, sequentially, right? So there comes a batch job. Batch job can help us to process the records parallelly. So let us see with an example. So in this example, let us see what I want to achieve. I'll just tell you step by step. Just follow. I'll drag and drop a flow with HTTP listener. As usual, I'll configure it with port 8081. So path is /test. Then just for testing, I want to create a list with some numbers as payload 1 to 100. So I'll drag and drop this transform message, and here I want payload to be a list of 1 to 100 numbers. So I'll just copy paste. Yeah, I'll just double click on it and I'll paste this array. So here I have a payload hard coded from 1 to 90. Okay, so now I have a payload of type list and size 90, just to simulate how batch processing. Assume that there are 90 records which we process. Normally in batch we process more number of records, but just for testing, let's say I want to process 90 records concurrently. So now the payload is a collection. So what I can do is, in the core module there is batch job. I want a batch job to execute or process all these records concurrently. In one batch job there are two parts. You can see process records first and on complete. So in this process records we have one batch step. I'll just rename this as step 1. Okay, in process records we can have multiple batch steps. So I'll drag and drop again, and here I can again rename it as step 2. Okay, so there can be record processing in multiple steps. I'll drag and drop one more. I'll name it as step 3. Okay, now actually there are two phases right now, whatever you can see here: process records phase and on complete phase. In this on complete phase, I'll just drag and drop a logger as of now. We'll see what I can do next. Now in each of the steps I'll just drag and drop a logger just to print what is happening here. Okay, in logger 1 I'll just write in step 1, and payload I'll just write hash payload. Similarly here in step 2 logger I'll write in step 2 and payload. In step 3 here also I will write in step 3 and payload. Just try to understand the concepts. I'll tell you a real good use case next. Okay, so right now you can see in batch job there are two phases: process records phase and on complete phase. But in batch job there is one more implicit phase. What is that? That implicit phase is called as load and dispatch phase. So let me just draw the diagram and show you graphically. There are three phases in batch job. So Actually, you can see on the graphical UI, you can see only two things: process records phase and on complete. But there is an implicit phase called as load and dispatch phase. So actually, the input payload to the batch job will be a collection, right? Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. So the input to batch job will be a collection. The implicit phase, load and dispatch phase, what it will do is it will iterate through that collection and it will create one record object and populate a queue called as records queue. So there will be something called as records queue. Whenever payload comes as a list, it will iterate over each element in the list and create one data structure of type record and populate the record queue. So all the elements of the list will be populated. Once the record queue is populated, then the batch job actually starts. Batch job instance starts. In one batch job, there can be n number of steps. That means in process records phase, there can be n number of steps. And for batch job, there will be a thread pool by default of size 16 by default, which we can tune as well. So what happens is all the threads in the pool will be polling for records in the record queue. Once a batch job instance starts, the threads in the pool will be polling for records in the record queue. So there are 16 threads, right? By default, each thread takes one record and executes step 1. So that means step 1 is concurrently executed by the threads in the pool. So once step 1 is executed, again the thread will put the record back in the queue. The record will be kept back in the queue, right? So actually record is a data structure, right? And inside this record data structure, there will be some fields which will say what is the status of the record. The status can be something like step 1 complete, step 1 failed, right, like that. So the status of the record will be updated by the thread and it will be kept back in the record queue. Okay, after some time, whenever another thread picks up this record which is already processed, then it will check, okay, this record has undergone step 1 already, then automatically call step 2. And once step 2 is completed, again the record will be kept or pushed back into the queue. And again at some point of time, one of the thread in the same pool might pick that record which has undergone step 2, and then it will understand, okay, step 2 is complete, then it will call step 3. That means the record is going through step 1, step 2, step 3 sequentially, but lot of records are actually executed concurrently. So that is what a batch job does. And one thing is, when a thread tries to execute step 2, we can configure a condition and say whether the step 2 would like to accept a record or not, right? So let me show you in the diagram here. There are 3 steps right now, and you can see on step, if I click on each step, there is some accept policy called as no failures, which is default. That means step 2 whether it can accept a record or not is decided by the accept policy. That means when record is going through step 1, if exception is caused in step 1, that will be treated as a failure for the record. And the record data structure will be updated saying that status is failure in step 1, etc. Right? So when the same record comes to step 2, when another thread picks that record and tries to execute step 2, it will check the accept policy is no failure, but the record has failed. So step 2 will not be executed. Then it comes to step 3. Now for step 3, I can configure all. That means step 3 may want to execute all the records, whatever might be the case, failure or success. So step 3 will be accept. We will be accepting that record, right? So like that I have. And one more thing is, for each step I can have an accept expression also. So along with the accept policy, this accept expression, if I have configured, it has to evaluate to true. Then only the record will be accepted by the step 2. So in this case, what I am getting as payload? Numbers, right? I want step 2 to be processed maybe for all even numbers. So what I can do is, I can write a simple expression like this. I'll just simply write payload mod 2 modulus 2 is equals to 0. That means on even numbers it will be accepted. So step 2 will accept only even numbers, right? But step 1 will accept all, step 3 also will accept all. Now step 3 I have not configured any accept expression. I said accept all. Okay, that now I have 3 steps. Now what we can also do is, in every step you can see there is something called as aggregator. So suppose in step 2 I want to write to database. I don't want to write each record one insert every time. I may want to do a bulk insert. That means I want to aggregate up to 50 records, and once 50 records are aggregated, I may want to write to database, right? So let's assume I have I'll just add a database module just for now. So let's assume that I want to do an insert. If I just drag and drop an insert here, what will happen? For each record, this insert query will be executed. I don't want to execute insert for each and every record. I want to do a bulk insert. So what I can do is, in the aggregator for every step, I can drag and drop something called as batch aggregator, and I can specify what is the aggregator size. Let's say 50. So this batch aggregator, what it will do is, it will aggregate until 50 records come. Once 50 records come, then it will invoke whatever is inside. So suppose if I am using a database component, I will do a bulk insert where the payload for this bulk insert will be list of records. So at every step, if we want to do aggregation, we can actually use a batch aggregator. Right now what I'll do is, I will just drag and drop a transformer so that, logger, so that I can display it. So just I'll drag and drop a logger here, and for this logger I'll just write an expression as a message. So I'll just paste it here, whatever I have, so that you can see what is that. I'm writing a data wave expression where I'm just having expression where I have a map. Key is logger in batch aggregator of step 2 and value is a payload. Actually, what will be the payload in this aggregator? It will be a list. So it will print the list. Okay. So now step 2 will accept only even numbers, and this aggregator will aggregate 50 records. Maybe I'll just give here instead of 50, I'll give 20 so that I can show you clearly what happens. And once all the steps are executed by all records, then the last phase of the job called as on complete phase will be triggered. Right? In on complete phase, the payload, if you see, it is an object of batch job result, the result of execution of this batch job. So here you can see in this batch job result there are a lot of records, failed records, loaded records, on complete phase, exceptions if any, processed records, successful records, all this. So we can use this batch job result object, extract the data inside it, and maybe we can generate a report out of it, right? So in this logger, I just write right now in on complete phase and plus plus, I just say payload dot total records or processed records. It will show me the records processed. Okay, so that's it. Now I have a batch job configured. You understood what is happening internally once batch job is triggered. So tell me, just think, when will the batch job instance be created? When the control comes after transformer, if the payload is a list. Actually, the payload to the batch job must be a list. Once the payload is a list, the batch job instance will be kicked off. So once the batch job instance is kicked off, there are 3 phases in batch job processing. First step is load and dispatch phase. During this phase, what happens? It iterates over each element of the list. For each element of the list, it will create a data structure called as record and populate the record queue. Then once the load and dispatch phase is completed, process records phase starts. So for the batch job, there will be a thread pool. All the threads in the pool will be polling for the records in the record queue. Once a thread gets a record, it will execute step 1. Once step 1 is completed, again the record will be kept inside the records queue. But while keeping the record in the records queue, some variables will be updated in the record which tell what is the status of the record, whether step 1 is complete or step 2 is complete. What is the status of step 1, whether step 1 is failure or success, etc. So, and again, when the same record is picked up by another thread, it will identify the current status and will try to execute the next step. And for each step, there can be accept policy or accept expression. So if you want your step to process only successful records in earlier steps, you can configure accept policy as no failures. And if you want your step to process all the records, then you can keep it all, right? And also we understood that every step can have an aggregator. If you have a scenario where in every step you want to insert into a database, instead of inserting each record, you can aggregate some records and then you can execute a bulk insert kind of a thing. Like that, in this case, when you are using batch job, records are processed by each step. Records are processed by multiple threads concurrently, and each records will go through the steps sequentially. So let me just run this application and see what happens. To kick off this application, I need to actually give a request to /test, just to trigger, just for showing you an example. Okay, so let it start. Yep, it started successfully. Now to trigger this, let me just give a request to /test. I hope it should have been triggered. Now let's see the console. Yep, I can see lot of logs. Let me explain you here. Yep. So if you see this logs, it says starting loading phase for this batch job instance. A batch job instance has been created with this instance ID. First loading phase has been started and finished. Once loading phase is finished, then execution phase started. Here you can see the logger in step 1 got executed for all the records, and I can see almost 90, all the 90 records are processed. Then step 1 finished. Then step 2 started. You can see step 2 is picking only the even numbers because I configured a condition to accept only even numbers. And you can see this is the logger in the batch aggregator. So whatever I wrote inside, whatever I configured inside batch aggregator is executed only after aggregating 50 records. Whatever, after 50 records only it got here, right? So sorry, here I gave 20 records. I gave batch aggregator size is 20. So after 20 records, whatever I kept inside aggregator was executed. Again, all the records are processed. Again, after 20 records, again this is executed. Like that you can see. And then here step 3 started even before step 4 aggregator is executed, right? So like that you can see all the steps are going through, all the records are going through steps sequentially, but lot of records are getting processed concurrently. And also you can see in the logs the thread number. This is the thread number 1, thread number 4, etc. So concurrently records have been processed by multiple threads, right? So now what I want is I can also configure in this batch job level max fail records. Maybe until 50 records are failing. Failing means what? Exception thrown in any step is a failure. So if any of the step throws an exception while processing a record, it will be considered as failures. So just one record failure should not stop my batch. If 50 records fail, then only I want my batch job to be stopped. I don't want to process any further records. I can configure max failed records, right? And one more thing is here you can see that batch block size is 100. That means by default is 100. That means whenever any thread is picking the record, if it is picking one record again, it will be too time consuming. We can configure batch job to process in batch of, let's say, 10. That means at once whenever a thread goes and picks, it will pick up 10 records. Okay, then it will execute either step 1 or step 2 or step 3 for those records. So that is nothing but the setting of batch block size. Okay. So yep, there is something more to explain in batch. I'll continue in next video.